Hello students, whenever we talk about Mughal India, images of gardens and palaces and forts and monuments crop up in our minds. But that is not all that is there to Mughal India. And so it is extremely interesting to look at the social organization that prevailed at that time, and of course we will try and throw light on both the rural and the urban facets. But when you talk about social organization, let us begin by understanding that India has always been the land of the caste system. Indeed, the predominant characteristic of Indian society, which distinguished it from others, was the institution of caste. The origin of castes are shrouded in antiquity. The caste system instills a division of labor in society and segregates the population into mutually exclusive groups whose economic and social functions are clearly defined and are also hereditary. What are the categories of caste? If you look at old religious texts, Hindus have generally been divided into 4 castes. The Brahmins are a caste of priests at the top of the social hierarchy whose ceremonial purity was not to be polluted by manual labor. Next is the caste of the Kshatriyas or the warriors. Third, the Vaishyas are traders and merchants. And finally, you have the Shudras or the laborers. Below this, there were mlechas or outcasts to perform menial and unclean works. But the early medieval period, when we come to the early medieval period, we see that the 4 castes had been entrenched all over India. The ritually pure and the ritually impure existed all over the country, but while the Brahmins remained pure everywhere, different groups were identified as impure in different regions. India has always also been the land of the self-sufficient village community. Rural society in the time of the Mughals, we find the existence of the self-sufficient village community as the basic unit. This kind of a village society was the basis of economic life that survived for 2000 years. Villages were defensive, self-contained units designed for survival even during periods of war and alien domination. They paid taxes to whoever was at the helm of the state and were relatively unperturbed by the influx of foreign invaders and rulers. So, invaders came and went, but the village community remained on and on. Conquerors of India found a ready-made source of income, so they had no desire to destroy this system. Instead, they simply established themselves as a new and separate caste. The latter was the choice exercised by both the Muslims and the British. And it is in fact the village society which helped raise revenue for the Mughal administration. The reason why the Mughals could raise so much revenue from taxation without having a ruling class which directly supervised the production process was that the village society was rather docile. This docility was not ensured by a church hierarchy, but by a subtle network of internal sanctions which is not to be found in any part of the world. But what is interesting is that land always belonged to the village community. There was no king or emperor who actually owned the land, and in fact it is this aspect of Indian feudalism that becomes very different when you look at or contrast it with European feudalism. In each village, the dominant caste controlled the land, though their proprietary rights were circumscribed. In general, land would not be transferred or sold to the people outside the village because land generally belonged to the village community. Most villages belonged to cultivating castes, with each family tending customary but unequal shares of the land. So there was clearly, by virtue of the flourish of the caste system, there was division of labor in every village. Brahmins were not cultivators but performed functions of local priesthood in alliance with the locally dominant caste, and used low caste or untouchable laborers to cultivate their land. In each village, there were artisans who provided non-agricultural goods and services. For example, there were blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, cobblers, weavers, washermen, barbers, water carriers, astrologers, and watchmen. There was a lower class of untouchable village servants to perform menial tasks. So, how did the village community stand in relation to the state? In relations with the state, the village usually acted as a unit. In particular, land taxes were usually paid collectively, and the internal allocation of the burden was left to the village headman or accountant. The village council or panchayat was in charge of the local administration. It was provided a village policeman and settled disputes about land. Caste panchayats were allotted judicial functions and settled other social problems and disputes. However, the practice of describing the village as a community can be somewhat misleading because it might imply a degree of common interest that actually never existed in the village community. And there was a dominant class elite across the country. Over most of the country, there flourished a dominant class elite, an intermediate group of cultivators and artisans, and a bottom layer of landless untouchables, each group with differing levels of income. These intra-village peculiarities varied from place to place and changed over time according to the degree of outside fiscal pressure. But all over the country, the top group in the village were allies of the state, co-beneficiaries in the system of exploitation. In every village, the bottom layer were untouchables squeezed tight against the margin of subsistence. The extra-village exploitation was sanctioned by military force, inter-village exploitation was sanctioned by the caste system and its religious sanctions. Of course, the caste system, despite the exploitation that I have just referred to, there were advantages. The most interesting feature is that it fixed a man's occupation by heredity. It accounted for job security and allocated economic functions in a stable fashion in a society with no church hierarchy and an unstable political system. It succeeded in imposing sanctions which held village society together for ages, and it offered economic conditions and social status which the majority of the inhabitants found acceptable. The strength of the village society was that it avoided extreme polarization of economic interests and gave a portion of the community some stake in the economy and an inferior group that could be looked down upon. There was also the interesting feature of the joint family system that we see. A notable feature of the system of social organization during this time was the joint family system, which is common to many countries and is useful in providing a considerable degree of social security. All generations of the family lived together and pooled their income with little distinction between brothers and cousins in terms of family obligations. However, the system inhibited individual incentives to work or save and provided no motive for limiting family size. In the Indian joint family, women were completely subordinate to men, and adult men were expected to do what their fathers told them. We also come across tribal communities. In fact, in addition to the village community, India also had a large number of tribal communities at that time. Aboriginal tribes led an independent pagan existence as hunters and forest dwellers, completely outside the Hindu society. They paid no taxes to the Mughals. In present-day India, they are less than 7% of the population. In the Mughal period, of course, their size was probably slightly larger. We also find the emergence of classes in medieval North India. One can refer to the emergence of classes in medieval North India. For purposes of convenience, one can identify three broad categories of classes: the agrarian, the mercantile, and the administrative. Which were the major agrarian classes? The zamindars, well, one notices in Mughal India not only the existence of the notion of private property, but a whole range of superior and occupancy rights associated with land and its usage. Although in modern times we understand the zamindar as the owner of the land, in Mughal documents we find distinction between zamindars and other kinds of ownership, and also different levels of zamindars and zamindari as a right exclusive of and different from mere malikana or ownership. In Mughal times, zamindari referred to administrative duty, that of collecting revenue. It meant that a person had the right to retain a share of the total revenue collected as a salary for having completed this administrative job. What were the major agrarian classes? Well, below the zamindars came the large mass of peasantry, known very often by the generic term rayat or raya, among whom two stratification is visible. The Persian words used are khudkashta and pahikashta. Khudkashta meant a peasant proprietor owning his land and cultivating through his and his family's labor, with perhaps occasional hired labor during busy seasons. The pahishakta were those whose lands were insufficient for their needs and therefore they had to work for wages in somebody else's land, while their own land was cultivated by their families. Below the pahishakta came the landless labourers, referred to in Mughal documents as muzariyan. Again, such labourers were a recognizable feature of village society and in caste terms probably constituted the lower castes and outcasts. The major agrarian classes also included artisans and merchants. The artisans were usually the goldsmith, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the potter and the barber. Weavers constituted a separate category, and this is not surprising given the importance and the range of the textile industry that flourished at that time. Customary payments had to be made to the artisans out of the revenue collected in the village, so is told by revenue documents. The merchant class by Mughal times, you must understand, the money economy had spread all over India, and even if some amount of barter existed side by side, definitely the money economy had clearly surfaced, and different kinds of merchants could be identified. Alongside travelling salesmen, some of the larger villages may have also had their own small shops owned by the local bania. Above the village came the Ganj, which was basically a small town with a permanent market, particularly for grain, and in some cases was the district headquarter as well. Merchants in the larger cities and ports can be divided into four broad categories: those involved in long-distance trade, those in long-distance overtrade, those involved in sea trade, and sarafs who specialized in large-scale transactions. There were classes in the urban areas as well. In the urban areas, particularly at the center, which was the heart of the empire and where the imperial court loomed large, we come across a ruling class whose extravagant lifestyle surpassed that of the European aristocracy. In fact, the very word Mughal signifies something grand, something opulent, and that is clearly referred to here when you look at the classes that prevailed in urban Mughal India. It had an industrial sector producing luxury goods which Europe could not match, but this was of course achieved unfortunately by subjecting the population to a high degree of exploitation. The social mechanism which kept the villages passive also lowered labor productivity and provided little incentive to technical progress or productive investment. Mughal India had a good deal to impress the Western visitors. From the time of Akbar to Shah Jahan, the court was one of the most brilliant in the world. It was cosmopolitan and religiously tolerant. Literature and painting flourished, and there were magnificent palaces and mosques at Agra, Delhi, Fatehpur Sikri and Lahore. The nobility lived in walled castles with harems, gardens, fountains and large retinues of slaves and servants. That is why the very word Mughal signified something that was grand. At the apex of the social hierarchy at the center was, of course, the Mughal emperor himself. Below him were the Mansabdars, followed by the Jagirdars. Below the Jagirdars were the native princes and the Zamindars. The state in the context of the needs of society is also something we would like to look at. Abul Fazl defines the state in the context of the needs of society. He identified several categories of human beings in society, like warriors, artificers, and merchants, the learned or the religious classes like the Brahmins and the ulemas, and finally, of course, there were the laborers and the husbandmen. All these individuals, a rather homogeneous lot, are said to constitute basically, according to Fazl, three classes or categories of men: noble, base, and intermediate. The nobles possessed intellect, sagacity, administrative capacity, eloquence, and courage for military duty. The other two classes were self-centered. The laborers and husbandmen were relegated to the third or the lowest position. Abul Fazl's views of the base or ignoble classes reflected the prejudices of the contemporary upper classes in Mughal India. It implied that those belonging to the lower rungs of the social ladder ought not to aspire for a share in state power and administration, which should be the exclusive prerogative of those belonging to noble families and upper castes. And the emperor was, of course, the fulcrum of the entire empire, and he was at the apex. And that is what also justified the despotism that he gave vent to. The existence of evil and corrupt segments in society justified despotism of the monarch. For only the emperor who possessed the requisite qualities could prevail over these sections. It was the king's responsibility to maintain social order and stability by preventing strife among the various sections, and he was also duty-bound to put each segment in its specific place. Social stability demanded that each member functioned on the basis of the social segment to which he belonged, and everyone ought to function in due subordination. In fact, Akbar had maintained that when a menial takes to learning, it is at the expense of one's duty. That is the kind of division of labor that was actually part and parcel of the social organization that prevailed in Mughal India. Fazl thus recommended a social division of labor and that each person should specialize in his allotted station in life. You are often reminded of Plato's idealism when you come across Fazl's views on social division of labor. It will in fact not be far-fetched if a parallel is drawn between some aspects of Platonic idealism and that we see in Abul Fazl. The keynote of Plato's theory of politics is contained in the oft-quoted dictum: unless philosophers become rulers, or rulers truly and thoroughly study philosophy, unless political power and philosophy are united in the same hands, there will be no period to all the troubles of states and humanity. Well, apart from the fact that Akbar himself approximated the essential idea of the philosopher king of Plato, Fazl would have his ideal king choose for his companions men who are ornaments of the court by the light of their wisdom. At the head of this class stands the philosopher, who, with the assistance of his wisdom and example, purifies the morals of the nation and trains himself with the noble aims of putting the welfare of mankind upon a sound basis. Abul Fazl divides his society into four classes. You know, just as Plato had divided his ideal classes of the republic into the philosopher kings, the military auxiliaries, and the economic producers. Like Plato, Fazl also arrived at an almost identical order. While Plato divided his ideal society into three classes, Fazl divides his into four: the warriors, the learned men, the husbandmen and laborers, and finally the artificers and merchants. It is obvious that the last two of the subdivisions of Fazl remind us of Plato: agriculturalists, traders, and industrial workers, and the first two are identical in the two classifications advanced by Plato and Fuchs. Fuchs believed that the state is basically a living organism. He in fact likens the state, the body politic, to a living organism. Just as the balance of equilibrium in any living creature is contingent upon the balance among the four elements of fire, water, air, and earth, similarly, the stability or equilibrium of a polity is dependent upon a judicious division of ranks, with each rank or segment contributing to the prosperity and well-being of the whole. In the event of any segment transgressing its limits, the equilibrium gets upset. I think Fuchs was basically trying to harp on this social division of labor in society, because he felt that if every person who is contributing well to a particular segment of life does his duty judiciously and meticulously, he contributes to harmony that basically allows for justice to prevail in society. So what was the composition of the administrative hierarchy? To Fuchs, the stability of the realm depended also upon a sound administrative system, and the efficiency of the administration depended on the coordination of the four elements, that is fire, water, air, and earth. At the apex of the administrative hierarchy, there is the Nuwinan-i-Daulat, which comprises the highest nobility whose devotion shines through in the battlefield. They resemble the element of fire. Next is the Aulia Nusarat, that is the revenue officials who represent the wind or air, enabling the administration to breathe. This is followed by the Ashab-i-Shuhat, or advisors of the king, who represent water. Perceptive, experienced, and well-versed about human nature, they represent water inasmuch as they irrigate the body politic with their moderate views, contributing to the prosperity of the realm and the world. But if they are unsuitable for their job and end up giving wrong advice to the king, then they can conversely inundate the world with deluge and calamity. In the final category are the personal attendants of the king, who represent the earth. If they are free from the dross and the humdrum, they can be operating a magical effect on the king, but otherwise they can act like dust on the face of success. So what really shines out very clearly when we understand social organization in the time of Mughal India is that there is perfect symbiosis among the Hindu and the Muslim constituents of the population. The Muslim population was always a minority, but in Mughal India it had probably become about a fifth or a quarter of the total. A minority of Indian Muslims, about 10%, were descended from the Islamic conquerors, Turks, Afghans, and Mughals, who had come to India via the Khyber Pass. The rest included some forcibly converted Hindus and many more voluntary converts, like the low-caste Hindus attracted by the more egalitarian aspects of the Indian society, who were basically shown the way by the Muslims. The Muslim ratio grew over time because polygamy and widow remarriage. At the height of its power under Akbar, the Mughal Empire exercised religious toleration as well, and that had come out very clearly in Akbar's policy of Din Ilahi, which was of course premised not merely on ensuring religious amity among the various segments, but more than that also in creating an integrated population that would be a necessary ingredient for creating harmonious administration across such vast an empire. This is one of the main reasons why it was more successful in maintaining an extensive domain than the earlier Muslim sultanates of Delhi. That is basically the kind of social organization that prevailed in Mughal India, and one which enabled Mughal India to attain a pride of place in the annals of history. Thank you.